Hello and welcome to PhillyCAM TV and WPPM LP Philadelphia 106.5 FM. I would love to welcome you to a special PPM Fest production today. It is Community Media Day. We are celebrating here at PhillyCAM, both on PhillyCAM TV and PhillyCAM Radio. And in this hour, we are so excited to share with you a special program called Community Radio as a Tool for Change. And remember, you can watch on cable TV, listen on FM radio. We're also streaming at phillycam.org/watch and phillycam.org/listen if you need to tune in around the world and elsewhere. My name's Allison Durham, and I'm radio program manager at PhillyCAM, and that means that I am very much in touch with our radio programmers, supporting their work, and trying to make community radio happen at a Center City, Philadelphia. And today on this program, I'm so excited to welcome Alan Gomez, co-founder of Radio Populares, and also a part of Prometheus Radio Project, as well as Philly Community Wireless. And we'll also be talking with Rolando de Aguiar of Radio Volta and Prometheus Radio Project in years prior. And we will be discussing, right, of course, community radio as a tool for change, thinking about this in terms of the influence that community radio can have both socially, politically, and culturally, and how important it is to have local community grassroots radio in our neighborhoods here in Philadelphia and across the globe. We're going to introduce some music and welcome our guests in just a short minute. All right, so I want to welcome our guest, Rolando de Aguiar of Radio Volta and Prometheus Radio Project to discuss. Welcome, Rolando.
Hello, thanks.
Great to have you. And we're also going to welcome Alan Gomez, again, of Radio Populares and Prometheus Radio Project, as well as Philly Community Wireless, to discuss today. Welcome, Alan.
Hey, everybody.
Well, it's great to have you guys. I really appreciate you joining this discussion. And really, today we're kind of hoping to share, a little bit about kind of how WPPM got here. I want to let folks know that, today is WPPM LP FM's 6th anniversary. And what that means is it's 6 years of community radio from PhillyCAM. This is radio, by the people, for the people. We're a station that is non-commercial in nature, and really we hope that our programming actually represents the community, right? Stories from our neighborhoods, bringing in local figures, community figures to talk about issues that matter most to Philadelphians, and airing music that's locally, produced, really highlighting local music and sharing, personally curated music from DJs who are Philly folks, right? So with that, we're going to talk about the importance of that in the context of our 6th anniversary. But really, this is kind of a larger conversation, right? Thinking about why places like PhillyCAM and specifically community radio stations like WPPM are just so important to our communities. So I'm going to kind of kick it off with a question, to hear a little bit more about your personal histories. I would love to know, for both of you, what brought you initially to community radio? Maybe we'll start with Rolando.
Okay. Yeah, I was in the wake of kind of the mass demonstrations in 1999-2000. There was a new movement that arose kind of in various places, including in Philadelphia, called indie media, and where we basically, folks used some software to create websites where they could, post news. And I got involved with that with a group in Philadelphia during the Republican National Convention in 2000. And one of the projects of that movement was Radio Volta, which was a web radio station that kind of broadcast news from the RNC demonstrations. And ultimately that evolved into a longer term project to have a community-based web radio presence in Philadelphia. And that's where I was involved, mostly on the tech side, but also on the programming side. And met a lot of, long-term friends, people who became active in community radio, and other kinds of independent media within Philadelphia. I think that it's something that I happened to be there at that time, but I think for me the most important things was really the relationships that were built around that station in those days, like 2000 to 2001, a long time ago.
And I'd like to know a little bit more too about the climate at that time, like in terms of the sort of what drew you to that scene, like that work,
right.
The political climate, and why it felt important.
That was a lifetime ago.
Yeah, I'm sure, but thinking about the motivation and also the spirit of that work at the time, and we'll talk more about this, of course, later on in the program. But to touch on that, please.
Yeah, I think at that time there was really some energy about making your own media, and it was like this is if you think of the web as having really kind of emerged in the mid 90s. This was only a few years after that. And I think there was really a lot of energy around the democratization, around information, about sharing and making media. A lot of that's been, I think some of that enthusiasm may be tempered over the years, but that was really where that energy came from, was the ability to make one's own media with, people, like-minded people, and not necessarily have it, sort of constrained by what was, on larger broadcast media and corporate media.
Mm-hmm. And, with that, we've talked a bit. I know that you were a programmer also at one point. And so I'm curious too about your personal stake in wanting to create your own media and what, this opportunity gave you.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. I mean, these are things that I haven't thought about in a lot of depth in a long time, but, part of it was, I think at that time, and this is speaking, at a very personal level, like I was searching for community, and that at that time, a lot of the folks that I was interested in, that I saw making this media were doing neat stuff, and I wanted to be part of that. And I think for me, community radio, like that was very much the goal for me, was finding a community of people who had the same kinds of, values. And, I had little kids at the time, and they're all grown up now. But bringing them into a community where people were creating media and speaking their truth to power.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rolando, for that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that experience, specifically with Radio Volta, later in the hour. I do want to toss it to Alan to also please share your story. What brought you to community radio, and what was maybe another way to pose this is, what was your first exposure, right, to community radio?
Yeah, it must have been something in the water. It was roughly around the same time period. I often tell folks, one of the things that first kind of gave me the inkling to be on the air was I was driving around the south side of Chicago, late 90s, and I heard some DJs that just made me think, I can be this bad. And I called up the radio station. It ended up being WHPK, which was a Hyde Park community radio station. It was actually tied to the University of Chicago. But they had an open door policy in terms of who could apply, even if you didn't go to school there, which I thought was good. But it also kind of gave me some insight into differences of what my idea of a community radio station would be, and also a college radio station. Even though they had community programming, the decision-making process and a lot of other things were really tied to the university, and that, kind of like that was a little jarring in terms of like, what this space, ultimately had. I really appreciated a lot of the programming. I had a graveyard shift. I was doing, just, playing a lot of like obscure punk rock, in the wee hours of the morning. Which was great. It gave me some exposure. And then I connected with other folks who were doing other, other types of radio, and, like it's like pirate radio in other parts of the city, and it actually grew pretty large. There was like 5 of us operating out of a small closet-sized bedroom, and it eventually became like 50 DJs on 7 days a week, and we were renting an office in this 12-story building. And then the FCC came looking for us, and then there was transition. But it also really gave, I think for me, like that process, like it helped me identify more, like less about me wanting to, play music and produce as much programming as building platforms for other voices. And right around that same time, it was the anti-globalization movement. I was doing a lot of Latin American solidarity work as well. And I was in Ecuador for some major protests for against the free trade area of the Americas. And I brought with me a little 20-watt FM transmitter that like fit in my backpack. And I shared it with the technical director of a community radio project in Ecuador during the protests, and her jaw like hit the ground. It was like, she's like, I can't believe how small it is. The technology's just changed. She's like, something like that here, like it would be the size of a small refrigerator. And that just kind of like sparked this interest in me of like, oh, there's all these social movements happening. There's all these like things, and radio is such a powerful tool, to be able to like, organize and to also kind of like change the narratives. And again, still in that same kind of vein of like people were starting to produce their own media and also challenging the existing kind of narratives that we're hearing in mainstream media. It became, I think, like just it got kind of an obvious thing to like help try to build those platforms and support communities that were struggling for social change. I think right around that same time also we were seeing some, you could always have this analysis of like suspicions of a skewed narrative about, different struggles or different events as they happen. But not long after that, around that same time, was the Iraq War, and being in the middle of many protests in Chicago and around in other places, and literally hearing news reports speaking to the exact opposite of what the circumstances were. I think like kind of cemented that kind of the need to kind of make sure that we're creating and promoting our own versions of the reality that we were experiencing and expanding beyond that. So that's it in a nutshell, I think, what kind of drove me to get involved in it.
Yeah, well, I find that so interesting, right? This through line, thinking about like the political climate and protests kind of like sparking in a lot of ways this move towards community radio. And I think that's interesting, at least here at WPPM. I think that's when the station was founded in 2016, right? That was also a goal to be sharing stories that are underreported, unreported, or just combating otherwise oppressive narratives, media narratives, that we kind of see in the mainstream. So it's so interesting to hear you both say that as well. I think that really resonates.
I mean, if I could just add, I think even outside of the explicit, like messaging or so, it was what it really dawned, I think, on some of us was that there wasn't any space to even explore like what these new narratives or what this, like what our identity was, by us, for us kind of thing. And I think that's where like spaces like community radios, and even with the college radio kind of like exposure that I had, that it was like, oh, this is a really interesting non-commercial, model. And, like seeing like that, the more spaces that could exist that, like then the more that these kinds of like skills and stories and identities, could percolate and start to build out, and just like recognizing that there wasn't an existing space, for that, really kind of highlighted the need for that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alan. Any thoughts? I really want to, also touch kind of on like this this history of organizing as well, which is really, kind of ingrained in the story of LPFM specifically as well. But, definitely want to offer space to any further thoughts on that.
I think, I wanted to call back to one thing. I actually, it's funny, Alan mentioned college radio. I did that too. And I think that was a
and
really
I did it also.
Yeah, it was it was very much a door, kind of that allowed you to see that there were these liminal kind of spaces where you could do things that generally seemed out of reach, just in the general media landscape. My daughter has a college radio show now too, so like that keeps going.
Yeah, that's pass it on, right? Like we all sort of pass the torch. If you can't, that's the thing. If you can have access to college radio, that's awesome. But I always like to mention this to our PhillyCAM members as well, that college radio is so awesome, but not everybody will always have
Right.
access to college radio. And so that's
Absolutely.
also why community radio is so important.
For sure.
But yeah, definitely point well taken.
And that's kind of why I highlighted like WHPK just so happened to have an open door policy for community. But even so, it's like you could get voted out by the student body, the following semester. And then other schools like Northwestern, and I grew up in Chicago, if my story doesn't, they did not have an open door policy. So if you were not a student, you couldn't go there. And that's the case actually in many universities, right? It's a resource for the students. So that was like the other thing that kind of like what is a community, a community kind of access point, makes a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to give props to WPRB in Princeton for being kind of regionally an interesting radio station that does sort of follow the WHPK model, where it is community and college. And so, yeah, we definitely want to shout out our friends at other community radio stations in the region. Very cool stuff. Well, I also wanted to kind of dive into really the history behind how a station like WPPM LP even came to be. And really, I think it's fair to say that we and other LPFMs kind of owe a lot to the work of Prometheus Radio Project, which I'm sure you all could actually explain more eloquently than I can. But I would say, a group of community radio advocates and activists, really, based out of West Philadelphia, over the years working to support community radio, build community radio, and pass, legislation to make community radio possible, across the country. So there's a lot there, and I'm so lucky to actually have two people part of different eras of that history here in the room today. So I figured, first I want to acknowledge, right, as WPPM is 6 years old, every year we do want to reiterate as much of this history as we can because, yes, we owe it to people like Vanessa Maria Graber, our former station manager, for really helping to get WPPM on the air. She also worked at Prometheus Radio Project and was a part of that work. And PhillyCAM, being able to apply for that LPFM license and go through the voting process to agree that we wanted to do this and build the station and go on air on this day in 2016. It all leads back to Prometheus. So why don't we start with you, Rolando, because your experience at Prometheus is, kind of predates Alan's. So if you could kind of paint the picture for people who aren't familiar with his work, what is Prometheus? What's going on at the time, and what are you doing?
Well, I mean, this is I'm sure Prometheus existed as an organization when I was there, but for the most part, my involvement was not official. What we did is we had this event that we did every week with a couple of folks with Prometheus, like Petri Dish, who was running it at the time. We called Geek Night, and essentially what Geek Night was you would get together in someone's basement and with soldering irons and try little projects out to build things like handmade coffee can Wi-Fi antennas for directional Wi-Fi. This was 2003. At the time, that was my involvement with Prometheus, was hanging out with those folks in basements with soldering irons and coffee cans and building things like that, learning about different radio technologies, how these things can be built, what purpose they could serve. And then the folks with Prometheus would then take those two different engagements to build radio stations, and offer technical assistance with different projects.
And I also kind of in the context of that work, can you talk a little bit about even just kind of the mission and the goal of your work at that time,
Sure.
please? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, it was really about offering technical assistance um, to low power. I don't even know if low power FM was necessarily a term at the time, but small independent radio station, community radio stations across the country, across the world, so that they could do kind of the stuff that Alan was alluding to with the small transmitter in Ecuador. And for me, so the way that I was involved is sort of as a community member coming in to learn this stuff and contribute, what little I could to that mission.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that, Rolando. And my understanding too is in addition to like providing that technical assistance, I know Prometheus was very much at the FCC,
Mhm.
perhaps in later years,
Right.
working right to pass the Local Community Radio Act, which did occur in 2010. And that our station manager Vanessa Maria Graber could speak more to that moment. She was very involved in that, and she has told the story before here. But so much work behind that, no doubt. But after that, of course, right, Prometheus, I know, really worked to then set up some of these stations or these nonprofits, right, applying then for LPFM licenses post 2010. Work to support also the paperwork, of course, and in addition to that, engineering, building, and such. And Alan, I'm curious if you can, bring us to when you arrive at Prometheus and the state of things, and your involvement and the mission and meaning at that moment in time.
Yeah. So my involvement with Prometheus kind of like hopped a lot around supporting the Geek Nights. Actually, I think like we're kind of a predecessor to what eventually they started to do is barn raisings as a ways to bring people together, kind of demystify the technology through direct hands-on kind of participation in building things out. I think it was just a very, kind of like powerful mechanism to like build engagement around this project so that it wasn't, like just this kind of like monolithic thing, but rather a community oriented thing, even from the building of it. So I always had that in mind whenever I was at a barn raising with Prometheus, and I was probably at about, I don't know, close to 10 of them before ever formally working with Prometheus. And we had similar kind of processes, although a little more spread out and stuff as we were building stuff throughout Latin America. So we became really close with the Prometheus gang, with Petrie and Hannah over the years. And I was working in the Darien Gap in Colombia on a health project for a couple of years in a conflict zone when the LCRA had been passed. It was this huge victory. I think a huge part of like what Prometheus had identified early on was that the FCC was using, basically like 100-year-old model for designating space on the dial, and corporate interests, of course, did not want to change that because they had plenty of side chain space on the dial that they were kind of hogging up and even capitalizing on, throughout the 80s and 90s, using that space that they claimed that they could not lose out on. They were using it for pager services, for example. So it was very clear that there was more space on the dial. The technology had changed to be able to allow that. And Prometheus challenged that. They did something referred to as the MITRE study, challenging the engineering behind it, and they won, which was like unheard of because this tiny little outfit out of West Philly, operating out of a Calvary church basement, had taken on this thing that was kind of almost embedded in stone. So that was huge. And when Obama signed it into place, it opened up the opportunity for thousands rural and urban locations to be able to apply, thousands of spaces on the dial across the country. And Prometheus then transitioned to then helping people identify, does your community have space? What are the technical requirements? What is the work that would need to go into it? And they would literally build the tools that didn't exist, along with a lot of other allies in the radio, the RF world. So it was really exciting. When I got news of it, like I said, I was like actually living in Colombia in a conflict zone. But then that got passed, and they're like, okay, now comes the next step, which is we won the policy fight. Now we need to support these different communities that have come together that are being allocated a space on the dial now to actually build the radio stations. And so that's kind of where I came in, and I was like a station support director, I think was my title back then. I arrived in Philly in 2014 and started working with Prometheus directly in helping to design, helping to implement, helping to acquire equipment and provide trainings, and also direct building of community radio stations. And did that in a number of different places. A huge part of that was also just like helping to organize some of the models. There were a beautiful array of different models of community radio projects that were getting licenses. So we kind of helped navigate all that, and including the design, the physical design of the studios, the physical kind of like structures, the engineering of how high that antenna is going to need to be street legal, to even like some of the organizational models of like, here's some structures that we've seen that, could help build out your station.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, Alan. Yeah, it's such important history, and I think to have you both here and talk about those different time periods with Prometheus is really incredible. And kind of beyond that, I want to kind of ask both of you about thinking about this question, right? Like how community radio can promote or be used as a tool for change. Can you both kind of like speak on that, specifically in the context of Prometheus's work, sort of like, especially Alan, you've talked, you mentioned, right, like in rural areas and urban areas, these licenses were available. And just if I can get some thoughts from both of you on that point of like, kind of like the question of like, well, why, like, what is the point? Why, what can these stations do is kind of like the question here to think on.
Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, a couple of scenarios come to mind that for me were really eye-opening. I mean, like seeing these things kind of play out in practice was really powerful. And in Nicaragua, I had built a radio station around 2004 for a women's co-op called Maria Luisa Ortiz Cooperative that was made up of women who were actually, a lot of them were widows that had lost partners or family members during the dirty war in Nicaragua. The Contras, and also even just post-revolution in Nicaragua. And just an amazing kind of like organizing body. It was like 19 women. They had actually come together to rebuild the town after Hurricane Joan. And one of the things they'd also started doing was tackling infant mortality rates, because this particular region was not a municipality. There was no hospital. There was no, just no resources. And so they started doing a lot of work kind of organizing their community. And they had grown quite a bit in the town proper, the town called Mulucucu. But the only infrastructure that existed for a radio was run by a pretty extreme evangelical church, maybe even actually right-wing evangelical church that would denounce the women as witches and lesbians, and just basically just try to discourage anyone with an earshot, or and thinking about these days, it's like there's access to so many avenues of communication and stuff, and even so, but there wasn't. So like that was like the only radio station that people would hear about this. So in the more rural areas, that 2-day horseback ride, they would try to encourage women to come in for prenatal visits as early as possible, as they were trying to like address infant mortality rates. And they found out about the work that we were doing, and they said, we could really use a radio, because we need to be able to share our messages as well and kind of counter this narrative that's being done in the town proper. Everyone knew the work the women were doing, and it was like, a loved project there, but on the more outlying areas where actually the need was even greater, there was just a lot of confused messaging because of the way that this evangelical church was using their radio station. So we went there and built this radio station, and it became actually the most listened to station in the area. It still is extremely popular in that zone. I know Petrie's visited from Prometheus Radio. I've invited many other folks to visit down in the station, and it's like the most listened to station. And they've been doing now stuff around climate change, stuff around gender dynamics, stuff around domestic violence, stuff around all sorts of other dam projects, and you name it. They're just like they've just opened the floodgates on the type of like messaging that they're doing, and increasing awareness for the whole local population there. It's just been like, to me, it's like an amazing example. Another one was a station in Ecuador where the community is a Salasaca community, which speaks Quechua, and this is like I think it's like this kind of internalized colonization, where it's like a lot of like the important communications would still be happening in Spanish as opposed to in Quechua. And as soon as we set up that radio station, one of the primary goals there was that they would promote the use of Quechua as their natural language. And I had left for a couple of weeks and I returned, and they had told me like, oh, there's an elder who had passed, and they were making the announcements. And the night before they had made the announcements. And then for the first time, their public address system, which would send out messages to the community over loudspeakers, had always done it in Spanish and kind of in Quechua as an afterthought. But when they started doing these announcements on the radio in Quechua first, it actually changed. Now the public service announcements on the speakers started doing it in Quechua as well. So it's kind of like reconnecting with something that could seem so obvious, but in the moment it seems like forgotten. And this kind of like helped change that, or denormalized that expectation of which is the dominant language. So those two examples for me, just like how important it is to like have this access and this sense of agency through the radio waves.
Thanks so much, Alan, for that. Yeah, that's both incredible examples. Of like what actually can happen when community radio exists in communities. Rolando, did you have any thoughts on this too?
No, I think those are both fantastic examples. I think I don't know if I'm sure Alan has more thoughts on this, but one of the things that I think for me, was important in my community radio, this early community radio experience, was just actually bringing people who hadn't known each other previously into a community, and giving them, I think, the strength to then go and explore their own media making. And I think about, in those early Radio Volta days, who the folks that were in the room at the time, and you're talking about, Petrie and late Jim Bear of G-Town, and Anto of PhillyCAM, and all those folks in the, they didn't necessarily, they maybe barely knew each other before that. They all came into the room, and it gave them this energy to go and explore and do their own projects, which is, from my perspective, looking back on it, a kind of remarkable thing.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll kind of resume this discussion in a moment after we take a quick break. So stay tuned. This is a Community Media Day special on PhillyCAM TV and WPPM 106.5 FM radio. It's community radio as a tool for change. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. All right, we are back, and you're tuned to Community Radio as a tool for change. This is Community Media Day on PhillyCAM TV and WPPM 106.5 FM. We're also streaming online at PhillyCAM.org. And not only is it Community Media Day, it's also WPPM's 6th anniversary today. And as such, we are raising money for WPPM. We're looking to raise $1,065 for that 106.5 on the FM dial. And we want you to be a part of supporting your community radio station in Center City, WPPM. You can head over to ppmfest.org to make your donation. I also want to plug that, it's not just one special live program you're catching today. At 3 p.m., we will begin a very special program, Community Media Day Live. That's from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., simulcast to PhillyCAM TV and radio. And what you can expect is a guided tour through PhillyCAM's studios. We'll be chatting with WPPM programmers, PhillyCAM TV producers, and some special guests. And at 5:30, you'll hear live music from local funk group You Do You, coming straight from PhillyCAM's garage. And we invite you to join us and come on down to Randstad. That's 699 Randstad Street, and join in catching the band live from our garage. We'll have a reception afterwards and continue to try and raise that money for WPPM. Light refreshments will be available, and we'd love to meet you. If you're a listener, a viewer, come hang out with us on this Community Media Day. Okay, with that message, I want to welcome again our guests for the program. We are joined by Alan Gomez, co-founder of Radio Populares and former personnel from Prometheus Radio Project and Philly Community Wireless. Let's bring Alan in. Welcome back, Alan. And we're also joined by Rolando de Aguiar of Radio Volta and Prometheus Radio Project in earlier years. Welcome back, Rolando.
Hi.
All right. It's great to have you guys again. We've been talking about how community radio can be used as a tool for change, but also we've been talking a little bit about the political movement building that also is kind of a big part of low power FM history. And discussing, how radio stations like WPPM and our friends at G-Town and so many others really can be used for the betterment of our neighborhoods, right? Telling stories that are untold in our communities or undertold in our communities, bringing in local voices who otherwise would not have access to the airwaves, talking about how a lower barrier to entry to be on the radio also can empower people to really, take power into their own hands to share narratives that are actually reflective of life experiences. And so I want to kind of dive back into the discussion, really thinking about how in your experience with helping to build stations and also experience at community stations, also has spawned kind of things after the fact, greater things beyond. And I want to talk a little bit more about Radio Volta with you, Rolando, and talk about your history. And Alan, also hear even a little bit more about Radio Populares and sort of what came of that project. But first for you, Rolando, for listeners who are not aware of what Radio Volta was, can you tell us about that and also kind of draw that connection with web community radio and what that has meant for like the future of community radio in Philadelphia, or the present day, I should say.
No, okay, I can do my best. I haven't, I think I'm not sure if I'm prepared to really give the full history, but Radio Volta, as I mentioned earlier, kind of emerged as the web radio arm of the indie media movement in Philadelphia during the Republican National Convention in 2000, the demonstrations around that. And then subsequently, it was a web radio station that ran, in either whether there was someone in the room or whether we had set up some kind of automated system to broadcast web radio, different kinds of shows. There were talk shows and a lot of music. And I do think we actually had some, we would do things like broadcast some third-party material, or broadcast. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but we would on the web station would send stuff out. But the group of people that came together to build this, we were initially in the back room of a house on Baltimore Avenue, and then moved. I want to say in probably 2003, 2004 to a studio on Lancaster Avenue at what's the Lancaster, 4134 Lancaster. I'm not sure if it still has the same name, but at that time it was called Lava. Built a studio there, and would tried to get as much community involvement as we could. People in the neighborhood, people from that sort of local community in West Philadelphia, as well as bringing people in from other parts of the city. And some of the folks that were part of that included Anthony Mazza, who is at PhillyCAM now. Had previously, he was started at Radio Volta, was at Prometheus. I got a fellow, Jim Baer, who passed away last year, who was one of the founders, if not the founder, of G-Town Radio, and Petri Dish, who was the kind of the founder of Prometheus. All those folks were involved in Radio Volta in those days, all meeting on a monthly or bi-weekly basis, and getting bitten by mosquitoes in someone's backyard, having that's the kind of things that I remember, and really a tiny studio, that's really the size of a bathroom, doing web radio at that time, and contributing what abilities, abilities and skills they had to build something small. And I think all those folks went out and did other things, and expanded kind of the reach of what community radio is in Philadelphia, what LPFM ultimately was, though I think LPFM was really, it was still a few years off at that point.
And I'm curious too, like at that time, what was the conversation about, like wanting to, operate one day like a legit LPFM or FM station? Was that in the conversation? Were there aspirations?
Yeah, it
was. To do that?
It was. We had there was, and I can't remember the terminology, but there was another station. It was a church station. Boy, are you thinking
WPEB in West Philly?
WPEB, yeah, that is what it was, right? Mm-hmm. And it was just the continuous, kind of struggle to get onto the air and to help support WPEB. And boy, I could use another brain here to remember the details.
It was a long time ago, and no, that's it's great to hear. That's fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Rolando and Alan. Please chime in. Any I kind of to give you the same question here. Thinking about your work in Latin America, and if you just could kind of share some anecdotes or stories actually about building those stations and what that really meant for those communities, and even the people that you met along the way, and to kind of illustrate not just not just like the victory of getting a station on the air, but actually like the real stories behind what that means for people.
Yeah, I think like for me, and a lot of the work that we were doing was like really tied into like this notion of demystifying the technology, like that people shouldn't be afraid of the soldering iron and putting stuff together, and that there's some with some basic knowledge you could do some really awesome experimenting with things, and I think it was like that was like part of our ethos, like around popular education, like setting this. But I think also like even as like people are like, oh, we can build our own physical station, that there was also this kind of like point, and you could kind of almost see it happening, like of confidence and just like self-discovery of like, oh, wow, this person is totally has like this imagination for what they want to convey, for what they want to message out, and they might have not been doing anything with that. And having the radio station or building on that, having this kind of like connectivity to it, a space that allowed them to kind of like, this is fertile soil, plant your idea here, really allowed them to practice that and actually start to take shape. So it's like seeing like that almost happen immediately, and then you'd see that kind of like start to develop more. And even outside, even beyond the, like any kind of explicit political kind of like struggle or anything, just seeing that kind of identity taking shape in a way that they could confidently kind of broadcast and create a space for themselves and for, people just like them in their community. That didn't have to be a polished, radio voice that, is like what they're used to hearing in commercials or something. It was like, it could actually change and flip it on its head, like what can be a type of radio program that connects with the people around you. And that was huge. That I think was like one of those things that has a lot of intangibles kind of connected to it. But it's the kind of thing that we realize, like, without these kinds of spaces, without, like spaces like PhillyCAM, without, even beyond radio, like public access spaces, web radio, places that, can act as platforms for people to be able to kind of like deliver their best imagined selves, back to their communities. It's like that itself is also a skill building that allows. And I've seen a lot, like of those kind of scenarios, but here in the States as well, like even just with our community radio station, which was called Free Radio Westtown, and it was pretty short lived, only lasted like a year or two. But just seeing out of those 50 DJs, some were like high school students, some were college professors, some were it's like folks that did stand up, that were doing radio stand up, kind of like just, it was just so many different things beyond just like any one particular message, that it really kind of like gave gave a lot of flavor to that community, gave a lot of, like, I think there was, sometimes we would hold fundraiser events and stuff, and like tons of people would come out and say, yeah, I've never heard of the station, but I've been told about it. And, and I've been told like explicit things about this particular show and all these other kinds of things. So it's like people were fans of it in part because it was so homegrown. It was, like something that they could relate to. So they would be looking for it and really appreciative of it. And I think like spaces like this, like, like I would refer to them as like commons, are the types of spaces that can best serve that function, and so like PhillyCAM, the public access stations, web stations, and these other platforms, I think are integral to maintaining that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Alan. And I do want to, maybe take this to a bit of a personal level for you both. I'm curious, experiencing these things, being a part of supporting community radio, and in many cases, like seeing sort of the fruits of your labor and really seeing the change in our communities, the change within ourselves that kind of comes from that. I'm curious about how this work has informed, things that you've gone on to do. Alan, you in particular now, are working with Philly Community Wireless, and I also, can acknowledge that through line and would love to hear more about that. And Rolando too, for you, any way that kind of work has informed your current way of life. It doesn't have to be a job, right? It can be the way we think. Feel free to pass it along.
Alan, I encourage you to go first.
Sure. Yeah, I think the work I'm doing with Philly Community Wireless, I think is like, it feels like an extension, like in many ways. Obviously, RF technology, there's overlap there in that sense, but the pandemic exposed a lot of shortcomings in access, and I think a lot about, there's resources that have become integral to, like a certain quality of life, and I think like, as those become more and more necessary, like having a space for, having a space for our local voices, but also like even being able to access this, and so like when I look at the work that we're doing with Philly Community Wireless, is like challenging the existing models, like kind of like broadening our imagination of how we can be active agents in the design of these projects and these things that kind of help shape the world around us, that we can also have a hand in shaping those. And so I think like all the community radio experience, seeing these kinds of things, it's like those things that broadcast to us are, inevitably helping to shape our frame of thinking. They're inevitably, like helping us, or we're adapting to that, and that, so therefore we should also have a say in how those things get adapted. So I think like that's just kind of been a common theme for me, that, that early exposure to the community radio world, and also like just building and developing agency through that is has come through as an extension for me in terms of like any kind of autonomous kind of work. And I referenced a little bit of the work I was doing in Colombia, which is like a health project, like teaching lay people medical practice, and I was doing logistics. But again, that's also about developing agency, having a say in these things that are usually done to us or for us, that we can also have a part in.
And I think, the sort of mentality and values that brought me to community radio in the first place. I mean, it's hard for me. I mean, I don't work in this arena. My partner does. My wife works with funding community media in Philadelphia, and a lot of the relationships we built kind of have led to that work. But the values that bring you to community radio of independence, and trying to create one's own stories, and making sure you hear others' independent stories, or something I've tried to broadly espouse and take advantage of, and pass on to my kids and my community. But as far, I just the folks that I met through my community radio experience are some of the strongest, and they do admirable things, and it's been wonderful to keep up with them over the years.
Thank you so much for sharing, both of you. And I'm gonna leave you with kind of one last question. I'm gonna plug the fundraiser yet again. Today is Community Media Day, and PhillyCAM is celebrating by broadcasting special programming all day, including this show. And at 3 p.m. we'll start Community Media Day Live, which is a 3-hour simulcast event. And in that time, we'll be looking to raise $1,065 for WPPM for our 6th anniversary, which is also today. And so the question that I pose to you is, why is community radio worth investing in? How about Alan? I'll call on you.
I think community radio is, like it's almost like a foundational structure, I think, in terms of, like what we could understand about the way that we communicate amongst ourselves. Like radio is still such a fundamental element. I think the world of podcasts and, like even web streams, I mean, none of it functions without like the development of people's voices. Like it's, you could have that. And I know that right now, like things like Spotify, which I, knock on wood, I've never had to resort to, things that create algorithms for us that, kind of shape us. I mean, we used to be really critical about the music industry in terms of, like, oh, that's a really popular song because there's a whole mechanism behind it that's generating interest. And so it just feeds it this feedback loop and so forth. And so a lot of things get ignored, and having the human component there, that's like kind of developing their own set of interests and sharing that out, to me, like, like is always been just such a key element. And I think the same thing in terms of voices and the narratives that people build. And so like space that, like radio, a community radio station, like is that kind of space where people can help hone their abilities, hone their voices, actually even go through a process of discovery and rediscovery. So I think that's a key reason why to invest in it.
Yeah, I think Alan alludes to podcasts, and I think that that's an interesting contrast with community radio, insofar as podcasts are these to my mind, largely isolated streams of information, whereas community radio required people to get in the same room and talk to each other in a way that independently produced content or programming doesn't. And to me, I feel like a broken record, but I do think that the nature of community radio, bringing different voices into the same room, creates a certain kind of, a more sophisticated, more well-informed discourse than necessarily these individual atomic, individually driven, programming.
Yeah, thank you so much for thoughts on that. And I have to agree. I know I'm, here I am plugging our fund drive. Of course, I got to promote, the great stuff that we do here at PhillyCAM. But I also, really believe, and I think that it's a really interesting conversation, right? To have also a conversation about like the spontaneity that, or the happenstance kind of magic that happens with FM radio, and specifically with community radio. I think one thing that I always love to talk about when I'm geeking out about community radio is like that experience, which actually kind of echoes what you all have just mentioned, is to I think maybe we've all had it where you're perhaps driving and you've got the radio on, or you're listening to a home stereo and you've got the radio on, and maybe you're listening to a music show, and somehow in the right moment the DJ plays your song, and it's like it's like not a song, it's like a unique song that you're not going to hear anywhere else. And all of a sudden you have this personal connection with this DJ, and they're a real human being, and they live most likely in the same city as you. And, in that moment, it's like serendipity, and you can't possibly get that feeling on a podcast. So yeah, I'm sure you guys can relate. Yeah.
I think like the potential to be sitting in on a great conversation happens, just because, happens on radio, whereas in a podcast, it's like obviously a very curated, model, and not to diss podcasts. I mean, I think that they serve, a quality function, but I think so if I started doing a podcast, I think like my discovery of that, to be able to take that on could also come from the experience of being at a radio station, and that's kind of where I think it's like, that's a space where, so many things could come together, and you discover or rediscover, I'm going to start making music, or I'm going to start doing this podcast, or I'm going to start doing interviews, just a wide variety of things that could continue in other ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Any last thoughts before we wrap up from either of you?
Well, I want to congratulations. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've really enjoyed this. It's allowed me to think about some things that I really haven't, put a lot of thought into in a number of years, and I've enjoyed it. But go ahead, Alan.
No, yeah, congratulations. I agree. This has been a walk down that lane as well. But it is really exciting. It's exciting to see, how PhillyCAM has continued to grow, and just being such an integral part of the landscape here in Philly.
Well, thank you so much for saying so. And thank you also for your work in community radio over the years. I was mentioning it behind the scenes before, but, every person who's a part of this history, I think, is really, is crucial. And I think everybody has a story who's, been a part of it. Everybody's got their piece. And so it's really awesome to have you both a part of this conversation, community radio as a tool for change. And I'll close out. I want to let people know yet again, we are beginning our 6th anniversary fundraiser here at WPPM. You can donate at ppmfest.org. We're looking to raise $1,065. It's Community Media Day, and we're so happy to be presenting special programming. Stay tuned. 3 p.m. It's Community Media Day live right here on WPPM. I'll throw up the graphic and say goodbye. Thanks so much, guys.
All right. Thank you so much.